Director of the Center for Global Christianity in the School of Theology. For the last few years, faculty and students roughly affiliated with the center have been doing research trying to document the sanctuary movement of the 1980s. And of course, some of us are old enough to actually have very active memories of the sanctuary movement of the 1980s, and to see the new sanctuary movement emerge, and to recognize the importance of linking the two. The person whose idea this all was is Professor Roldan Figueroa. He's been the driving force behind this project, and he will be speaking to us first. But the project has uncovered just rich and vulnerable documentation located in the basements and closets of multiple houses of worship in Jewish and Christian traditions throughout New England. Preserving these materials and learning from them is a big purpose of why we are here today. So this is very much a shared enterprise. We are very thankful for the support today of the Jewish Cultural Endowment, and also for the support of the School of Theology, together sponsoring our conference today. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our first speaker, the founder of this project, Roldan Figueroa, to come forward.
Thank you very much for everyone. I'm just going to take a moment to turn my my email off so that we're not disturbed by this. Well, again, thank you very much for coming today, to all of you. I am very grateful for Dana's introduction. I'm also grateful for Ireland, who has been working with me in this project from the beginning. Also, Professor Jonathan Calvillo, who has been working with us along the time. We're very grateful for the presence of our keynote speaker, and we're going to learn more about her and from her work. So thank you for your effort to come here today. Thank you for all of you for being here. Now, there are a couple of things that I want to say about the Sanctuary Project here at Boston University, and our effort during this time since 2015. We began in 2015, and we were trying to find a home for this project, and we found a home with the Center for Global Christianity and Mission. We began in 2015. The idea was to start identifying the sources, the archival resources of the different communities of faith that were part of the Sanctuary movement. Now, Dr. Daryl Ireland and Daniel Demas, they are going to talk later on about some of these resources. But what we tried to do from the beginning was to digitize them. Some of these archival materials are found in church basements, in closets, in small rooms, and we wanted to make sure that we could catalog the material and preserve it. And that's why we began digitizing the material. And Daryl is going to give you some numbers related to the number of images that we have digitized so far. We had a number of collaborators, as I just mentioned, Daryl Ireland, Jonathan Calvillo, but also a research assistant, Leah Mickens, and Laura Rambikier. Laura Rambikier is an activist related to the United Methodist Church in the state of Arizona. She came to study at the School of Theology and do her Master's of Divinity and dual degree in social work. Meanwhile, she began a seminary, a trip sponsored by the School of Theology, and we have had that now for 3 or 4 years, in which students from the School of Theology travel to Arizona and other states as part of their studies during a week. So we have that now for 3 or 4 years, but it was really started by Laura Rady here. And she did some research about the sanctuary movement in Arizona. It was at that point that we realized that if we wanted to do a really strong historical project, we needed to narrow down the project, and we decided to focus in the area of New England. And the materials that you're going to see today and that we're going to be talking about are materials collected from communities of faith throughout the area of New England. In doing so, we discovered connections with Chicago, connections with New York City, connections to different sites in Texas and Arizona. So the project keeps growing, but what we see is the need of the creation of networks, of a network of scholars who are interested in the history of the sanctuary movement. Our contribution is to focus in New England, but we really need to reach out to other scholars around the country. Now, I will be reading a paper to you for the next couple of minutes, and the paper is focused on Community Church of Boston. This is an early draft of the work that we are doing with different communities of faith. And at the end, we'll have some time for questions and answers. So thank you. The sanctuary movement, which began in Arizona in 1982, sought to accomplish a twofold objective. Activists in the sanctuary movement intended to change U.S. foreign policy towards Central America. In addition, they aspired to change U.S. immigration policy. In the area of immigration, the sanctuary movement specifically challenged the political process that governed the admissions of refugees to the country, as well as the level of protection granted or denied to people seeking asylum in the U.S. Sanctuary activists contended that immigration policy, especially policy towards refugees, was used as a tool of U.S. international relations. In the context of the Cold War, it meant that internationally displaced people from the Soviet Union or countries aligned with the Soviet Union were treated more favorably by the U.S. In contrast, equally endangered people from countries governed by regimes aligned with the United States did not receive the same treatment. Activists of the first century movement saw a clear connection between the arrival in the U.S. of asylum-seeking persons and U.S. policy towards the ruling regimes of El Salvador and Guatemala. In this regard, it should be noted that while the sanctuary movement was relatively small, its questioning of U.S. immigration policy posed a credible challenge to the conception of territorial sovereignty that props up the modern nation state. Indeed, the sanctuary movement was taken seriously by the U.S. government. Sanctuary workers were routinely arrested, and several related criminal trials drew national attention. In 1985, then Commissioner of the Immigration and Naturalization Service, Alan C. Nelson, characterized the sanctuary movement as a smuggling operation and sustained that the movement undermined the constitutional safeguards of the country. The sanctuary movement in New England began as a grassroots undertaking. Robert Thurber interpreted the movement as a continuation of the culture of protest that flourished in the Cambridge-Boston area in the 1960s and 70s, especially in reaction to the war in Vietnam. However, it is probably more accurate to see the germination of the sanctuary movement in New England as a result of the combination of several factors, including the culture of protest that crystallized in the preceding decades. Other factors included the mobilization of people of faith that responded to the plight of Central American refugees in light of their own religious traditions. That is, communities of faith in the greater Boston area and in New England open up their places of worship and support Central American refugees because they saw such actions as consistent with their own religious traditions. In fact, when we trace the early trajectory of the movement, the complex character of its beginnings becomes clear. In November 1983, the Community Church of Boston became the first community of faith to offer sanctuary to Central American refugees in the Boston area. Diego Mendoza Lacan, who was known by the pseudonym of Manuel Rosales in order to hide his true identity, came to the U.S. as an undocumented immigrant from his home country of Guatemala. Manuel lived for a year in the facilities of the congregation located in Boylston Street, Boston. Around the same time, Old Cambridge Baptist Church also offered sanctuary to a Salvadorian trade unionist. Estela Ramirez lived in the facilities of the American Baptist congregation and participated in advocacy efforts throughout the region. The movement was not limited to the Cambridge-Boston area. Members of the Mount Toby Friends Meeting House in Leverett, Massachusetts, became ardent activists demanding fair and just immigration policies. Similarly, the New Hampshire province of the Sisters of Mercy opened its doors to Central American refugees, although it is not clear if they actually hosted refugees from Central America. Sister Angeline Wyden of the Justice and Peace Office of the Diocese of Manchester was an active advocate on behalf of the refugees. Nevertheless, Cambridge remained an important regional center of advocacy. In fact, the city of Cambridge proclaimed itself a sanctuary city on May 8, 1985. By 1987, there were 12 public sanctuaries in Massachusetts, placing the Commonwealth among the top 10 states in the number of public sanctuaries. Another important factor that helps us understand how the sanctuary movement took up roots in New England is found in the agency of Central American refugees themselves. Many of them organized and created institutions that channeled their hopes and aspirations. This was a pattern that first emerged in Washington, D.C., but was not limited to the national capital. Indeed, Central American immigrants were working on behalf of recent refugees before most other organizations did. The creation of immigrant-led organizations that responded to the crisis in Central America was often the result of close multi-ethnic and multiracial alliances. One example of this was Centro Presente, probably the oldest organization of its kind in the greater Boston area. Centro Presente was founded in 1981 and since then has continued to address the needs of the Central American diaspora in New England. Community Church of Boston, Sanctuary as an Act of Conscience. Community Church of Boston was, and still is, a member congregation of the Unitarian Universalist Association. Throughout the 1980s, the UUA became one of the most involved religious groups in the sanctuary movement. In June of 1983, the General Assembly of the UUA voted to support and encourage UU societies that gave sanctuary to Salvadoran and Guatemalan refugees. In addition, the General Assembly recommended that all societies engage in, I quote, a serious searching of conscience on this issue, end of quote. By 1987, there were 67 Unitarian Universalist-related public sanctuaries. That was the highest number of public sanctuaries of any given religious denomination. By comparison, in 1987, there were 64 Roman Catholic and 43 Jewish public sanctuaries. These numbers were published by the magazine Basta in 1986, which was kind of the official voice for the movement. Certainly, these were places of worship that were declared public sanctuaries. Yet, that did not necessarily mean that they had people actually living in sanctuary. During the decade, public sanctuary took several modalities, and one of them was to give financial, political, and spiritual support to those places of worship that provided shelter to individuals and or families seeking respite. And I think this point is important because my understanding is that Congregation Bethel, which became a sanctuary, in its statement actually mentioned that this would be their role or their modality of sanctuary. So it's important to keep that in mind. Congregation Bethel and Sudbury. The practice of sanctuary did not have a single national modality. James A. Corbett was one of the leading voices of the nascent sanctuary movement. In a letter, a circular letter of 10 August 1983, Corbett theorized about some of these modalities. The letter was a concept paper, and it circulated widely among the communities of faith seeking to articulate a response to the refugee crisis. For example, he wrote of the necessity to establish a, I quote, sanctuary screening and referral service, end of quote. His chief concern was the access or lack thereof that refugees communities in the U.S. had to information and counseling. He called for the creation of a referral service or a sanctuary screening and referral service. In particular, he singled out the importance of doing outreach among Central American refugees in LA. As he pointed out, I quote, the service will provide the initial sanctuary screening. It will refer potential sanctuary candidates to counselors, and for those refugees who are not potential sanctuary candidates, the service will provide information about a full range of social and legal services and referrals to appropriate organizations and agencies. And that's a copy of the letter. So this is a circular letter, and I think that what happened is that probably in Chicago or in another center, copies were made of the letter, and it circulated among the different the communities of faith that were involved in the sanctuary movement. So this is a copy that I found at Old Campus Baptist Church. And I have highlighted, I think, parts of the letter where he actually makes the points that I just mentioned. Corbett also advanced a second concept, namely the creation of a system of standby refuge. He realized that the practice of public sanctuary could pose a risk to the safety of refugees. Once their identity and location were disclosed, it would be almost effortless for authorities to detain and process them for deportation. Hence, he intended this system to help protect the identity of de facto refugees. And that's a term that was coined by an attorney in the 1980s, de facto refugees, because this was a part of the problem, that the displaced people from Guatemala and El Salvador were not recognized as refugees by the U.S. government. As he described this alternative, Colbert states, I quote, "In this connection, we also need to develop a system of standby refuge for refugees who do not wish to participate in declared public sanctuary." So Corbett here was dealing with a problem that we're going to see with Community Church of Boston. If the refugee will play an important public role, it meant that potentially the identity, the location of this person will be known, and it would put the refugee at risk. So what Corbett was saying, probably we want to have this as two different locations. Places where people who are not willing to take this risk, or maybe families and children, can go to these places of sanctuary, and those who are willing to take this public risk can go to other places of sanctuary. Sanctuary in the New England region took on different modalities. The experience of Community Church of Boston represents one of them. The chief characteristic was the public role that the refugee living in sanctuary played in presentations meant to create and raise awareness about the civil war in Guatemala. In April 1983, the Board of Directors of Community Church voted to use their facilities as a place of public sanctuary, and in June of that year, the decision was ratified by those attending the congregation's annual meeting. Reverend William E. Alberts and members of the Community Church of Boston Sanctuary Planning Committee drafted a sanctuary statement later that year, some point between June of 1983 and September of 1983. The statement appeared in the form of a circular letter, and it became a model for other places of sanctuary throughout New England. The statement summarized the reasons why the board of directors had decided to provide sanctuary, I quote, for Central American and other refugees who are pursued by immigration authorities and whose deportation will result in their imprisonment or execution, end of quote. And here you have a copy of the sanctuary statement of Community Church of Boston. It's a two-page document. And other places of sanctuary drafted similar statements. We also have a copy of the Congregation Bethel that adopted also a statement, and Old Cambridge Baptist Church. I think that this ought to be edited at some point and circulated more widely. Community Church saw sanctuary as an act of conscience. The affirmation appeared twice in the opening as well as in the closing lines of the statement. In the more precise use of the two formulations, it describes sanctuary as an act of conscience in solidarity with our brothers and sisters of America, of Central America. That was a quote. Unitarian and Universalist principles undergirded Community Church theological case for sanctuary. Drawing upon its institutional history, it made a direct connection between the practice of sanctuary and its origins. The men and women who founded Community Church were people of, I quote, diverse political, economic, social, and religious backgrounds, end of quote. Their strong ethical commitments made them critics of World War I, that's stated in the sanctuary statement. They articulated an ethic of brotherhood and sisterhood that transcended nationality, race, religion, political ideology, and sex, and revered all people as members of one human family, end of quote. The political situation in Central America and dissatisfaction with U.S. policies towards El Salvador and Guatemala featured prominently in Community Church statement. In providing sanctuary, the document proclaimed, we are saying no to the United States' oppressive, undemocratic intervention in Central America in our name, and yes to self-determination and justice in their name, end of quote. Democracy, understood as the sovereign right of people to self-determination, was the primordial political principle that Community Church considered to be at stake. The activists at Community Church of Boston drew a parallel between El Salvador and the war in Vietnam, describing U.S. involvement in the civil war of El Salvador as another Vietnam. One of the rhetorical strategies in the statement was the use of counter-definitions. The Salvadoran Revolution was not, I quote, imported from Nicaragua, Cuba, and the Soviet Union, end of quote. Instead, it was the direct result of the oppression exported by the United States, I quote. Similarly, it stated that the democracy is a code word for imperialism, freedom a code word for terror, and patriotism a code word for plunder, end of quote. More importantly, the declaration disputed the characterization of Salvadoran de facto refugees as economic refugees. We believe, it continued, that the administration is seeking to cover up its oppressive policies by claiming that people are leaving El Salvador for economic reasons. To the contrary, they were fleeing political persecution, and the policies of the U.S. were an important factor that forced people to leave the country. In this way, Community Church appropriated the lexicon of the Cold War and redeployed it in defense of the practice of sanctuary. Another significant trait of the declaration was its use of traditional themes associated with New England, even if remaining oblivious to the historical complexities of these traditions. For instance, it compares Central American refugees to the Pilgrims. Interestingly, Community Church of Boston
did not address the Pilgrims' problematic heritage as initiators of the long-term displacement of Native American peoples in the region. Nevertheless, they saw a sort of correspondence between Central Americans who had been displaced by civil war and the Pilgrims. As the Pilgrims, people from El Salvador and Guatemala were forced to leave because of persecution inflicted by oppressive military government. That was a quote. In order to call attention to this identification, Community Church announced in the statement that it will welcome a refugee to be in sanctuary by Thanksgiving of that year. Moreover, they wanted to reclaim the tradition of Thanksgiving in order to underscore that just as in the case of the Pilgrims, the U.S. should still be a sanctuary for people fleeing persecution. Characteristic of the sanctuary movement, especially in New England, was to draw on rich liturgical traditions to frame the practice of sanctuary. In fact, the statement announced a featured worship service for this purpose. I quote, "After the refugees arrive, we plan a community service of Thanksgiving with a public religious political statement that reclaims the noble tradition." End of quote. Community Church of Boston and the development of institutional structures. In addition to articulating an ethical rationale for their involvement in the sanctuary movement, Community Church of Boston also developed new institutional structures to better channel its response. In spite of the movement's claim that the practice of sanctuary was deeply rooted in American history, the fact is that there was no immediate precedent of a large-scale national sanctuary movement. Even the early to mid-19th century Underground Railroad that served as an inspiration for the sanctuary movement was far too removed to provide models and organizational patterns that could be easily followed. Refugee resettlement work was the closest experience that could inform the practice of sanctuary among North American communities of faith. In fact, many communities of faith around the country have been deeply immersed in refugee resettlement in the aftermath of the two world wars as well as the war in Vietnam. However, the structures that have been developed for the administration of refugee resettlement as well as the strategies of public outreach that were crafted for this specific goal were either ill-fitted to deal with or disconnected from the legal realities of international displaced people from Guatemala and El Salvador who were never recognized as refugees by the U.S. government. In the early 1980s, as the Central American refugee crisis was unfolding, the Massachusetts Council of Churches coordinated refugee resettlement efforts throughout the Commonwealth for member institutions. However, the Council was only working with individuals and families who entered the country as refugees with the full vetting of the U.S. government. Consequently, at the time, the Council was mainly working with refugees from Vietnam and Cambodia, who were resettled in different parts of the Commonwealth, but mainly in the city of Lowell, Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Council of Churches handled refugee resettlement through a specialized committee that had clear institutional form. From 1980 to 1983, the Council's refugee project was coordinated by the Refugee Sponsorship Development Steering Committee, which was administered by a coordinator. The Council worked in close collaboration with the Church War Service, which provided financial support as well as technical expertise for refugee resettlement work. However, the committee seems to have steered away from the sanctuary movement, at least officially, since I have not found official documentation to indicate otherwise. Communities of faith that became part of the sanctuary movement, therefore, had to develop new structures to channel and coordinate their work. These specialized committees were often headed by lay people, and their composition illuminates the character of the movement in New England. Community Church of Boston established direct contact with the Chicago Religious Task Force, which facilitated the process of identifying a refugee or refugees that would live in sanctuary at CCD. The Chicago Religious Task Force performed this and other functions at the national level, and sanctuary activists in New England recognized it for its national leadership in the movement. Within the greater Boston area, the Ecumenical Sanctuary Education Committee coordinated sanctuary efforts among sanctuary activists. CCD also instituted a specialized committee to facilitate its sanctuary-related activism. The Sanctuary Planning Committee was already active since the spring of 1983. The committee was chaired by Caroline McDade, and other members include Eva Alberts, Bill Alberts, Sybil Cox, Cynthia Foster, Gertrude Friedman, Bob Green, Hop Hapter Mariam, Mike Aikman, Diane Jaffe, Jeffrey Lewis, Ellen Mass, Inez Miller, John O'Brien, Jake Boyden, and Lorraine Roth. CCD's pursuance of these networks and new institutional arrangements was consistently predicated upon the two main objectives of the sanctuary movement. As stated in their first circular letter of 25 October 1983, we have made contact with the Chicago Religious Task Force and are prepared to welcome one or more, up to 3, refugees into our midst by possibly Thanksgiving. In so doing, we're politically confronting and seeking the change on U.S. policy. And on a more personal and human level, we are responding to the consequences of our government's policies on the lives of El Salvadoran and Guatemalan people. As Bill Alberts said in his recent public editorial, we are creating a new foreign policy, one in keeping with the values of respect for human dignity and self-determination. And that's the fragment of the letter that I just read. One of the initial tasks of the Sanctuary Planning Committee was to recruit the support of other members of the community. In their circular letter of 25 October 1983, the committee expressed how CCD envisioned its own engagement with the practice of sanctuary. The committee somewhat naively stated that, I quote, "The refugees will literally live in the church center for at least 2 weeks." It turned out that he lived in the center for a year, or a little more than a year. To make the public statement and to fill out the response of the Immigration Naturalization Service, end of quote. The letter also outlined some of the expected challenges. For instance, he noted that a 24-hour monitoring service would be needed. The committee clearly stated that, I quote, "Education on the realities of what is happening in Central America is one critically important part of sanctuary," end of quote. The committee invited interest parties to participate in sanctuary, but alerted them to the demands of their commitment, which is a very important theme that comes up, and probably our panelists can comment on that later on. Diego Mendoza Lacan and Rigoberta mentioned. Another important feature of the practice of sanctuary at Community Church of Boston was the public role played by Manuel. From the beginning, CCD articulated the expectation that the refugee living in sanctuary will be required to make public presentations addressing the situation in Central America. Perhaps a common weakness of historiographical accounts of the sanctuary movement is an overemphasis on the agency of mostly white communities of faith. Hence, this aspect of sanctuary at CCD ought to be explored in greater detail. In May 1984, at Manuel's request, the MAGA activist Rigoberta Menchitun made a short visit to Community Church of Boston. She addressed a sympathetic audience of people who were both concerned about the civil war in Guatemala and worried about the fate of Guatemalan refugees in the U.S. That day and in that place, the two chief aims of the first sanctuary movement came together in the persons of Rigoberta Menchú and Manuel. Diego Mendoza Lacan was a student, painter, and poet who left his country fearing for his life and seeking safety in the U.S. In Boston, he used his skills to call attention to the genocidal war taking place in Guatemala and to demand that asylum seekers in the U.S. be treated fairly. Now, on my way here, I was able to contact Manuel over Facebook, And on my way here today, I tried to talk to him over Facebook, but I was not able to do that. But I just want to make some comments here. Manuel was a kind of ambassador for the situation in Guatemala, and that was part of the strategy of Community Church of Boston. He was a painter, and this is one of the flyers that we found in the holdings of Community Church of Boston, which, by the way, I'm very grateful to them because they allowed me to have these materials under my supervision while I started scanning them. And I still have 2 folders, which I plan on returning. But this is an important flyer because it shows some of the paintings that Manuel did. And these paintings and drawings circulated. And in a recording that Dean Stevens and I found in a box, it was totally by chance. We found this tape of when Rigoberta Menchú went to Community Church of Boston, and we have speeches by both of them. But there is a segment in which Reverend Albert is facilitating the conversation, and he mentions that the paintings of Manuel have generated $8,300 at that time. So we have a lot of documentation related to how they finance this, but that number is not in the papers, it's in the report. So let me give you an example here of how they circulated these paintings. One of them was in the form of postcards. But there was a painting that Manuel did that is called Guatemala Burning. And what they did, what Community Church of Boston did, is that they produced a poster based on this painting, and they produced the poster through an agreement with the Syracuse cultural workers. And this is the copy of the catalog of 1984. I believe it's 1984, actually it's dated 1988. And here is the page of the catalog that contains Manuel's painting of Guatemala Burning, which I found very interesting because it really circulated widely. Let me give you another example. This is a letter from 1986. By then, I think that Manuel was already living in Canada, and they prepared an exhibit dedicated to Guatemala, and one at the Cambridge Multicultural Arts Center. And one of the artists that was featured was precisely Manuel, and that's the letter. The other thing about Manuel is that he was also a poet. And among the holdings of Community Church of Boston, there is a small package of poems that Manuel wrote. And they have not been edited or published there. We just have them in kind of produced in a typewriter. And this is one of the poems of probably some 10 to 12 poems written by Manuel. The other thing that I would like to share with you is a clip of this recording that Dean Stevens and I found. He was gracious enough to make a copy of that tape. And this is the voice of Manuel in 1984, in which he was talking about the situation in Guatemala and trying to educate the public about how the military junta in Guatemala was organized. We're just going to listen to a short part of it.
It's one of the institutional things powerful in the highlands where the Indians is. And also, Captain Joaquin Sosa Vázquez, the member of the Army, Special Sergeant Julio Cortante, joined to the Army in 1981. He was a school teacher 20 years before.
Let me just stop there, but one thing that I found remarkable, Manuel was making his presentation in English. And at some points, you can hear him asking somebody standing by him, how do I say this word? But he wanted to make the presentation in English, made the presentation in English, and he was talking about the structure and the workings of the military. Very good. The other person that is important in terms of this narrative is Rigoberta Menchú. During her 1984 visit to Community Church of Boston, Rigoberta Menchú spoke through an interpreter for nearly half an hour. Her visit was part of a tour that she did in order to create public awareness about the appalling situation of the indigenous people of Guatemala. In her talk, she mentioned how people who had been displaced by work endeavored to cope with their reality while preserving their identity and dignity. She described scenes of violence and cultural repression, as well as a resulting internal displacement of Maya people throughout the country and the region. She highlighted the work of Maya women in the preservation of rich cultural traditions. Then, at one important point, she stated in a deep, sober tone, and I will read in Spanish with an English translation, "Para nosotros la solidaridad no es un favor, es una obligación, es una responsabilidad, es una tarea histórica de los pueblos del mundo. Nosotros hacemos allá nuestra guerra, nuestra lucha, pero ustedes tienen que hacerlo aquí, y no solo una vez, venir con una reunión, sino cosas concretas. Queremos verlo, queremos sentirlo." Translation: "For us, solidarity is not a favor. It is an obligation, a responsibility, a historical task of the peoples of the world. Back home, we do our work. We carry our struggle, but you have to do it here, and not just once by coming to a meeting. Instead, you need to do concrete things. We want to see them. We want to feel them." And I will close. I will just end with her own voice from this recording.
Y anteriormente de penas, de preocupaciones, pero de mucha esperanza. It is sad and it is worrisome, but there is a lot of hope. Porque estamos cansados, we are tired, cansados de vivir semejante historia. We are tired of living this kind of history. Nuestros padres.
So I will close with that, and that was Menchú in her recording. The interesting thing about both is that in terms of Rigoberta's own output, that recording, that speech is nowhere edited or it's just a recording, as well in the case of Manuel. So thank you very much, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Any questions or comments?
Are you going to publish this?
Fine.
Are you going to publish this?
Well, the part of the idea of the project is that, yes, if you want to write a history of the sanctuary movement in New England, so this is a draft for the chapter on Community Church of Boston. Yeah. Anything from, yes, Lisniansky.
Thank you for this presentation. I just wonder if, I haven't seen the schedule of things coming up, but I just wonder if we might sometime connect it to what's going on now, today, at the border, and the possibility of Trump sending refugees to sanctuary cities and the church's response.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, in fact, today we have two panels. We have one panel of those people who were involved in the first century movement, and we have a second panel with people who are part of the new century movement. So in those moments, we may have the opportunity to have that conversation. The other thing that I would like to say is that the reason we are doing this today is that from the beginning, we wanted the Sanctuary Project to not just to be an academic endeavor, but to be a kind of vehicle to coordinate and to work with activists who are involved in advocating for the rights of immigrants in the country. So that's the whole idea. And we're all already thinking about a second forum for next year, so that we can cultivate this conversation. Anything else?
Yeah.
What's Manuel doing now?
Following him on Facebook, last time I saw him, he's back in Guatemala. So,
Yeah, he says Happy Easter. He's traveling pretty soon from Guatemala to Ottawa. He goes to other places. He goes back and forth.
Good.
Very good. Anything else? Any other comments? Very good. So thank you then. What we will do then, this is actually very good for our schedule today, is that we want to move on to the first panel. Now let me just mention that our panels are going to be facilitated by two of our students at the School of Theology. And I would just like to invite Daniel Lawlord to come forward. And also the panelists, if you want to come to the front for this moment. So we would like to invite John Bach, Offner, William Albert, and Sara Lisniansky to come forward. And I will grab another chair. So Reverend Albert has a statement for us, and he wants to share that statement coming from Community Church of Boston. And then we move to the panel, and Daniel is going to cover. Thank you.
thank you. I was minister at Community Church when Manuel was there for 2 years. I started out as a Methodist, received my PhD from Boston University in the Department of Psychology and Pastoral Counseling. And I moved from Methodism to and became minister of the non-sectarian UUA affiliated Community Church of Boston. The fact that Community Church selected me as its minister without my being a UU minister reveals the loose relationship that CCB had with the UUA. When interviewed for the job, I was asked my theology. I said, I believe human. That helped. I later became certified as a UU minister, as it offered the greatest acceptance of my non-sectarian faith. After the sanctuary movement, I became hospital chaplain at Boston Medical Center for 18 years, and there I wrote a book called Hospital Chaplain at the Crossroads of Humanity. Now, my writing has also included articles appearing in the progressive website Counterpoint, the latest being an Easter-themed one called Opening Tomb and Resurrecting Lives, which is about the sanctuary movement, which provides oppressed people with a safe place and the promise of a new life. And that's what Community Church was about. It was one of 500 churches in the 80s providing sanctuary. Our refugee, Manuel, lived for 2 years at CCB in Copley Square on the 3rd floor. My wife, Eva, and our daughter Amy and I, Amy was 5 at the time, lived on the 4th floor. So we were quite involved at that point. Why sanctuary? At Community Church,
it becomes important to realize that most members of the non-sectarian UU-affiliated Community Church of Boston identified themselves politically rather than theologically or denominationally. They included communists, socialists, anarchists, and capitalists, among whom were Jews, atheists, theists, humanists, Unitarians, Christians, and those of no faith affiliation. Thus, keeping religion out of politics, a common sentiment of numerous Christians, was anathema to most CCB members. Some CCB members were involved in labor struggles and knew what it meant to be called communists. In certain circles, Community Church itself was seen as a communist front. It didn't have a good reputation in certain circles at the time. It was seen as a communist front because its weekly speakers platform included prominent critics of U.S. foreign policy and domestic policy, like the Berrigans and Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn and Dr. Beatrice Mons and Angela Davis and others. CCB understood that politics greatly determine who shall be rich and who shall be poor, who shall be free and who shall be oppressed. What brought such a diverse group of people together? CCB shared a universal ethic that transcends religion, race, political ideology, and sexual orientation, and reveres all people as members of one human family, which appreciated having that recognition. Now, with such a history, at a called congressional meeting in 1983, all but one couple present voted to support CCB's sanctuary church as a sanctuary church. The couple who abstained from voting did so fearing that the government would hurt the church. But after the vote was taken and everyone clapped, this couple wrote a generous check for the sanctuary program. Now, CCB, as was mentioned, was the first in the Boston area to provide sanctuary. Being prophetic is about taking risks. Risks that involve speaking truth to power, political power, and at times ecclesiastical power. Being prophetic involves providing an example for others. At times, it means being first. Key for any religious group providing sanctuary is the members knowing what the refugees they are providing sanctuary are fleeing from and what the members are getting into. Early on at CCB, the immigration officials called the church and requesting that Manuel come in the immigration office for an interview. We asked Manuel if he wanted to be interviewed, and he said no. We ignored the immigration official's request, aware that such interviews had led to undocumented immigrants being arrested and deported. After that, we were not contacted by any immigration official. Now, we had a sanctuary committee at the Rady. If immigration officials entered Community Church and arrested Manuel and others of us, committee members would have called our immigration lawyer, the media, and other members and community support group. Also, if my wife Eva is here, if she and I were arrested, Eva had arranged for close friends to care for our 5-year-old daughter, who's now 41. Regarding sanctuary, immigration, sanctuary, it providing a safe place, Manuel, supported by CCB members and other supporters, spoke about his people's struggles and U.S. complicity and his experience at a sanctuary to over 300 groups in New England and New York during his 2 years at CCB. Now, one other thing, a critical element of the sanctuary movement in community church was the ecumenical and secular support Manuel received, and community church too, from the larger community. Reverend Victor Carpenter, minister at Arlington Street Unitarian Church, he and the church 2 blocks down the street provided immeasurable assistance. Dr. Loretta Williams, Director of Social Responsibility of the Unitarian Universalist Association, arranged a press conference at CCB in which UUA President Eugene Pickett attended and endorsed the sanctuary movement. Catholic nuns initiated speaking engagements and shepherded Manuel, who was Catholic, through these events at churches and colleges. Jews and other people of faith became involved, contributing time and financial support, as did people not affiliated with the faith group. Manuel's presence and safety, additional speaking engagements, created increased solidarity among us at CCB and in our relationship with other faith groups and between us and a significant segment of the larger community. I want to end with a poem by Manuel. It's brief. It's on politics. Death without life, spirit without soul, head without body, white without black, yellow without red, negative without positive, capitalism without communism. Is it possible that only the 2 paths exist? To choose only one means the extermination of the child society. Today's sanctuary for many is the path to Easter's promise of liberation and fulfillment. And thank you for bringing me this time.
My name is Daniel Ballard. I am a first-year MDiv student here at Boston University School of Theology. And I just want to reiterate sort of our gratitude for the leadership of those who are here in attendance. And we're always innovating. And I really just appreciate, one more round of applause for those who are here. Before we go into our panel, I just want to read a short reflection, also a poem, by Judith McDaniel, who was involved in the sanctuary movement in upstate New York, and currently is a law and religion professor at the University of Arizona. Her book, Sanctuary, A Journey about the first sanctuary movement, was published by Firebrand Books. It says, "What distance must I travel? What must I venture? What must I risk? How much time is left to answer?" And she writes, "I believe we must each venture and risk and answer to our fellow human beings, the migrants and the refugees in our midst." And so this notion of solidarity really is deep within this movement. I want to give a moment first for the members of our panel here today to just say their name, their community tradition affiliation, just as a general introduction, and then after that I have a few questions for us to get to know one another better. So you could just go in a row, just say your name and just the tradition you're associated with.
Bill Albert.
Sara Lisniansky. I've been for the past 30 years in Montpelier, Vermont, the Catholic Synagogue. And then I
John Bach, Religious Society of Friends, the Quakers. I was very involved with the Quaker meeting in Hartford, Connecticut during the halcyon days of the 80s. Help?
Like I said,
Yes.
Take this one out here, all these very neighborhoods. Would you mind?
I'm Paul Offner. I'm a member of Congregation FL in Sudbury. We had a sanctuary project 30 years ago, and we have another one today.
And sort of in the last show, first, Carl, you started us off with kind of talking about what motivated your involvement in the original sanctuary movement and what's leading to a return to that work today.
This is a difficult question because one never knows, you know. Every Jew in my generation, and the previous one certainly, grew up in the shadow of the Holocaust. Beyond that, I suppose there's more general history. Jews historically have been largely Western Jews. And beyond that, it's a foundation point of our religion. I mean, the holiday we're celebrating now, Passover, is a holiday of escape from slavery. And it's actually, I believe it's actually the most widely celebrated Jewish holiday. So it's kind of built into, you know, what we do, what we talk about. Beyond that, I mean, I think I was always sort of politically active, even when I got to high school. I was involved in the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War. I was a teachers union leader for 6 years. And then when we moved to Sudbury, I just got involved in this because we joined the local synagogue, and the first bulletin we got said, "Oh, there's a sanctuary today." That sounds interesting. So, I mean, it was at that level. You know, that's how I got involved. But it sort of builds on a lot of stuff that is kind of already there. And I was certainly very aware of the egregious, vile acts of our government.
Sean, same question. What sort of led to your involvement with the original sanctuary?
I come out of the civil rights movement of the early 1960s, and then the anti-war movement of the mid-60s, continuing to today. In all those cases, and it was the look of horror and incomprehension on the faces of children, and on a molecular basis realizing that there is no system of political thought, gravity, or dynamics that can justify such looks of horror and incomprehension on the faces of children. And you turn away from those looks only at the peril of losing your own soul.
Sarah.
I don't have a prepared statement, but I
You did mine.
it's not going to work. I just want to say a word about Cover Up Shalom, which was my spiritual home. It's where I kind of came of age in the 1980s as a very young woman. Cover Up Shalom was founded in 1968 by a small group of rabbinical school dropouts and draft dodgers from the Vietnam War era. And the original members are actually, they're all men, which is interesting to think about. Can I push this back? Some feedback.
Yeah, go ahead. Just turn it off, Sarah.
Some of those practice the mitzvot to cultivate our own compassion and our sensitivity to injustice, and to strengthen us to act upon injustice and to help to heal this broken world. But my first encounters with Jewish life were all with Orthodox communities in Jerusalem. And that didn't work for me because I'm a lesbian. And I'm very grateful that I was really secure in my own identity at that age, as a strong feminist. And so a good friend of mine happened to be sitting in the second row and said, well, when you go back, you should go check out Hamarat Shalom. So what is a Hamarat? Is a fellowship. And usually how it's the contemporary term you could say was an intentional community. So I came to the Hamarat in the late 80s, and I found my home, and I learned how to walk out into the world a little bit. And I found solidarity. And I learned how to daven, that is, I was the sort of pray, but I learned how to become a peace activist. And I became very involved in the disarmament movement in the early 80s of the New Jewish Agenda, and ended up on a Witness for Peace trip to Nicaragua, a Jewish delegation, and they in the Hanukkah of 1984, and came back and co-founded the Central American Task Force of the Jewish Agenda in 85, and became increasingly aware of the plight of Central American refugees in the sanctuary movement, and we got involved in the bail fund, and we heard Estella from Lincoln Baptist Church speak, so we joined in practice. And whereas we could not unpack, we were a very small group, but we had a home, and this old house. I was actually living in a house. There were 3 or 4 of us living in the house at the time. And so we founded the Jewish Sanctuary Network, and then at Rosh Hashanah of 1986, the Great Sanctuary, and in the winter of 1987, we welcomed Emilio from El Salvador, and we were housemates, and we were on speaking tours together, and we visited Sudbury, and we ended up bringing over 3 of his siblings. One of whom was his sister Irma, who we didn't know was pregnant at the time. I remember emptying out my bank account. That was the most illegal thing that I did. And I was reimbursed, but I remember that day going to Western Union and had this address for somebody in Texas who was going to bring Irma and Malco in the toddler also came over. And I'll never forget when they arrived. I was exhausted, shell-shocked, and surprised. And it was great to kind of, and she gave birth in my home. I ended up in El Salvador. It's another story, but I was actually in El Salvador when Irma moved out in my own home. And we went to the company. So I'll probably give you my stories now. I ended up in Vermont, and now I'm busy on the northern border. And I'm documenting very much.
Well, you spoke on this with CC, but what do you think led you personally to make that decision?
Well, as I said at the beginning, I was a Methodist. And we were involved in the anti-war movement. Dealing with racism and and just a number of issues.
question is, what ideas, teachings, or practices, and I want to push it to like your specific congregation, informed you in the decision to do work with undocumented immigrants and refugees? And there are many temples and churches across the country, but not all of them made the choice to do this. They're all in the same tradition. But something happened in each of your specific congregations and communities in that particular history that helped allow this decision to happen. What do you think about the teachings or ideas of your local community that helped allow you to become a sanctuary church or temple?
I'm not so certain that there's anything specific, specifically Jewish, for instance, in our case, other than the kinds of stuff I've already talked about, although I suspect I'm sure, obviously, if I cover things. One of the things that we really tried to deal with was the fact that people have mixed views. And it's important, and we all do. Every one of us does. And the fact that somebody comes up with some sort of objection, if you think hard enough, probably part of you has that. It's important to try to bring that out and deal with it. And a number of years later, I wrote down, I spent a lot of time doing this talk with a lot of people. And so just, here are some of the things that help me. What do I find using this? One, what does this have to do with Jews? Two, there's no reason the congregation needs to deal with this. Individuals should just do what they think is right. Three, I object to my congregation taking a position I might not agree with. Four, religious organizations have no business in injecting themselves into public issues. Five, this is divisive and split the congregation. Our rabbi, by the way, who was in some ways the person who started the whole process, was very important. Very important. We Jews are a small minority. It's dangerous for us to oppose a government policy. And it's very dangerous to engage in something that, no matter how nonviolent it is an act of civil disobedience. Every one of those things raised and raised, at times somewhat feeling. And we tried to bring them out and to talk about it. And we succeeded. I mean, we understood, I think, or we tried to help ourselves understand that just because a person says something like this does not mean that that is the sum total of what that person believes. And so we really need to talk about it and as a result of it. And the resolution, in fact, passed the annual meeting of our congregation by 4.08%. So, so I think we did our work well, although my guess is it might have passed anyway. But things like that, I think, and by the way, in the latest incarnation of the Sanctuary Project, when we again proposed a sanctuary resolution, we didn't have quite as much time, but we did the same sort of thing. We met with a lot of people at the meetings and tried to open them up so that people would feel free to express concerns that they had. And, it's clear that a lot of people were out of their comfort zone. It's not something we do every day, and we should talk about that. In terms of more specifically how we framed it in the Jewish terms, I can tell you in the speech that I gave introducing the sanctuary, I referred to several things. First of all, that this was not just an attempt to help learners people read 10 or 15 people, or even a couple hundred. It was an attempt to help probably 11 million people. We were part of a national movement. It was not just one isolated congregation. Another point I mentioned was that, people raised the question about, isn't this just posturing? Does one small rural congregation or some rural congregation have to do with changing government policy? I mentioned the state. It made a big impression. Some years ago, James McGovern, who had been Congressman locally, was chief of staff, and been more than anybody else responsible for having us today, in this room, together, bringing the meaning of those words. And that is the way we cast it in Jewish terms. It's not uniquely Jewish, you know. Every religious tradition has a way of framing this kind of thing. But I think maybe that was some way for us.
As you may have heard, because Quakers get far more credit than you deserve, Quakers did have something to do with the original Underground Railroad, bringing slaves north after escaping from plantations, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, as well as trying to facilitate the escape of Jews from Europe in the 30s, before World War II. So when we had the business meeting to say, should we declare ourselves a public sanctuary and risk being arrested and risk losing the meeting house, there was a tsunami of negativity until somebody said, yeah, we have a decision to make. But the decision is not whether to get into the sanctuary movement, it's whether to stay out of the sanctuary movement. Because everything in our tradition says that this is where we have.
I very much appreciate the quote that you shared at the end, Carl. The moral imperative is for us as Jews is equally from the Torah and from our historical experience, which is the human experience. And it's impossible to separate the two. So, and as you said, the mitzvah, which is the precept which is repeated more times than any other in the Torah, is variations of the ahavta b'ger kamocha. You shall love the stranger or the other as yourself. And in fact, it's repeated 36 times, which just happens to be double ha, right? Ha is life. So this is the essence of life. These are two lives together, which brings us to the whole. And because how could we not? So that is our foundation. And again, it was a question of how that we wanted to do it, and that was a process because we operate on consensus. And there was a long process, and we got it.
I brings us to this microphone because we're recording everything and we're losing a lot of very valuable material. Okay. So, yeah, as you guys said, we're recording everything and we're really very interested in what you have to say.
For me personally, after I performed that Gay Mary, I was terminated. Most people fall from grace. I was pushed. And I landed on my feet with a radicalizing thumb. That helped to radicalize me because it wasn't just about the gay marriage. It was about racism. It was also about hippies on the common. It was about being political and opposing the Vietnamese, the war in Vietnam. So it became that personal element for me. But I've been moving in that direction because once you're in a parish, and if your mission, which the mission was to respond to the needs of the community, and if you really did that, it's the community. It's not a denomination, it's the community. It's not a particular race, it's the community. It's all people who are precious. So my personal experience is of that kind.
And then one topic that I wanted to talk a little bit the notion of sanctuary as civil disobedience, and just talk about, why did you feel it was necessary to go in this direction, to risk arrest, to break laws? What inspired that action?
I had already spent 3 years in prison as a draft resistor during the war in Vietnam. It was the most liberating thing I've ever done in my life. So to go into prison to find liberation is something that you never, ever quite get over. It's also this, just a sense of modesty. I would rather tell stories. I was I was a conductor on what was called the New Underground Railroad, operating out of the South Side Presbyterian Church in Tucson, Arizona. We would go as far south as Chihuahua to this magnificent convent, which was a safe house. So people with documented religious or spiritual persecution, if they got themselves to the Casa de los Amigos, the Quaker house in Mexico City, they were then taken to Chihuahua. We would go down and pick them up, take them to Agua Prieta or Nogales for a couple of days to get them ready to cross the fence, which was a 5-strand barbed wire fence, easily gone through. There were 2 brothers in the church who were sort of lost, and I got their story. They had come from a sizable village, someplace in the north, I think Chalatenango, El Salvador, and it was a place where the death squads were eliminating all the good people like us. The healthcare workers, the catechists, the educational people, the clowns, the newspaper people, the wonderful people, and everybody knew who the rat was, the snitch. So these two, because he was flaunting his new wealth. And they go to the village priest, who was probably on the list of people to be disappeared, and they said, "Father, what should we do?" And he said, "You must go to the chapel and pray for what you know you must do." So they went to the chapel and prayed for forgiveness. Then they found the guy and they killed him. And they moved north to Tucson, where they meet a young Quaker from West Hartford, Connecticut, who will spend the rest of his life meditating on that story.
So how participation in acts of civil disobedience, what would motivate you to break the law for the right thing?
I think it's important to be able to break the law, especially for religious people. There are those who are chaplains of the status quo. That's important because there are people who have needs that are met that way. But there are also prophets of the people who address not only the needs that call for chaplains of the status quo, but who confront the political and ecclesiastical structures that oppress people. So it became important for me in terms of my understanding of faith that addressing the political structure becomes so important because the political structure itself determines most who shall be rich and who shall be poor, who shall be free and who shall be oppressed. So it became very important that way.
As I said in the beginning, my intention was to live my life fully as a Jew. And if you carry any one of the teachings of the Torah to their conclusion, you're going to end up breaking some laws. There comes a time when you have to stand up to Pharaoh. Here we are, it's Passover. And our tradition and our history gives us courage to do that. We have to do that in some way every day, really. I remember listening to Estella, and coming back to that, and she was the Salvadoran who was in sanctuary at OCBC. And I remember she was telling her story, she was giving her testimony. And she just sort of paused in her script, and just stopped and said, "¿Cómo es posible? How is it possible? How is this injustice possible in this world?" And that was just such an awakening question for me. It was an invitation. And I remember we used that in a Haggadah that we created in 85 or 86 at the Figueroa. That question wakes us up. How is this injustice possible? And what is our role? And where do we find our strength? In one another, and our tradition. We have to take that to its conclusion, and sometimes we end up in jail.
I don't know that what we did actually 30 years ago actually was civil disobedience. And we talked about it. We talked about it a lot, and because people were concerned about it. And I remember one of the points we made was that we could do something, for instance, like bailing somebody out who was appealing for refugee status, let's say. This is legal. You could do this at the time. And then what happens when what's now ICE, what was then called the INS, I think, says, okay, it's all over, you got to turn the person in. You know, I mean, once you've taken responsibility, for a human life, it's not so easy to withdraw. It really is a responsibility, and that would be civil disobedience. And so we knew that we were getting into this. It never actually came to that. For a number of reasons. It was a different time. I don't think the government now would blend into it, something like that. But we did have a family in sanctuary, although it was a very loose form of sanctuary. We had no place to put them in our small room. We stayed in the house in the home of a congregant. Eventually we got in an apartment. But we did it very publicly. We did it publicly on purpose. And they agreed that we did public. And we took them on speaking tours and stuff like that to other congregations and so on. And we had a big welcoming ceremony, huge welcoming ceremony. We filled the whole room, called sanctuary. And we invited the press. And the next morning, we saw that the Herald, the Boston Herald, had called up the INS and said, what are you going to do about this? And the INS said, we haven't heard about it. Which simply meant that they were not about to bust a suburban Jewish congregation. And so we had that going for us, and that was good, but we couldn't count on it. I don't know, I can say more than that, but it certainly did come up.
Well, if you kind of going into that public policy question happens kind of two parts, but one is how do you think U.S. foreign policy at the time really contributed or caused this refugee crisis? And two, why is it important for communities of faith to challenge the government on foreign policy issues? Tackle either one of them.
Well, first of all, the connection was obvious. The U.S. government was funding the Salvadoran army and the death squads and training them. So there was a direct response, to U.S. foreign policy. And we were very aware of that.
And also with Guatemala, the United Fruit Company had controlled a lot of land in Guatemala. And the U.S. government helped to overthrow a democratically elected government, a government that was seeking to do some reforms that would help the Mayan Indians.
as far as giving them land. And certain U.S. senators called them, it's communism. Well, the capitalism had been exploiting them all over the place. But the code words like communism and democracy cover up a multitude of U.S. foreign policies. And it becomes important to confront the oppressor. Part of it is embracing the oppressed. Part of it is confronting the oppressor. That involves politics. And the sad thing is that a lot of people of faith run from politics. Keep politics out of religion, which it really stands. If we're going to really address people's problems, they're deeply political. And it calls for intervention.
In a similar fashion, what Ellsberg said about Vietnam, he said, we weren't on the wrong side. We were the wrong side. So there's a direct link between MS-13 now, the gangs, and the death squads, all coming out of the School of the Americas. Also, we would try to tell the INS people on the border about push and pull, that the refugees were not being pulled here, they were being pushed out of their country. I never knew any refugees, anybody in the sanctuary, who wanted to be here in spite of the washing machines, the microwaves, and our Hollywood starlets and our commodification of beauty. None of that. They wouldn't have known Karl Marx from Groucho Marx, but they did know Jesus of Nazareth, however you understand as being a great teacher, and that's what led them. They all would have gone back in a minute.
Yeah, so our resolution at the time, 30 years ago, was explicitly saying that there are now 500,000 Central American refugees in our country. Hundreds are deported to truth. We know that the refugees themselves believe that to be deported is to face death. And so while we do not know how many have been murdered, we know that there have been many. And they were being murdered by death squads and, Contras death squads, funded by our own government and encouraged by our own government. That was explicit in our resolution. And our resolution concluded by saying that our government should stop its support of these death squads and these repressive governments, contribute maybe to a peaceful resolution of some of these problems instead of being the problem. So yes, it was very explicit. Let's see if that answers your question. The answer for that question is exactly.
Well, it's just thinking about the U.S. role in foreign policy and the congregation to challenge it.
Yeah, well, yeah, so it was very explicit that the whole problem really was caused by our government, and that we were attempting both on a small scale and on a large scale to address that is in its acts of our government.
I have one more story, if I may, and I hope the State Department is listening. So during the war, a bunch of us, Quaker delegation from Connecticut, we have to lie through our teeth to get into Suchitoto, because it's under siege. So we get there, it's a good-sized town, and everybody goes, hey, do you know anybody from Norway? And they would say, isn't Norway just the greatest place in the world? They had no idea where it was. So we finally said, what is this thing with Norway? And somebody said, well, the Norwegians sent us 3 2.5 horsepower Briggs & Stratton engines. This is what's on your lawnmower. And with that, we were able to irrigate our fields, and we pretty much eliminated malnutrition and starvation. We were sending $1.5 million every day to the military. And we know what the Salvadorans thought about that, is as opposed to Norway, whom everybody loved at bargain and basement prices. This is why I'm advocating for our declaring war on Norway, surrendering immediately, and having them come in to take over our healthcare system, our education system, our prison system, and everything else. Aren't those Norwegians great?
One question I have is, if we had in this room every faith leader, secular leader, faith community leaders in Massachusetts
that we have set before us life and death, blessings and curses, and it shouldn't take us all afternoon to make up our minds which one we should be oriented to.
I cribbed that from Moses.
This is farewell address. Really, Deuteronomy, that's the
I would want them to be concerned about their own structure, and whether that structure liberates those clergy to be free to act in just ways in society, or whether that structure is one that calls for accommodation to what is, that is the status quo. I would be concerned that the executive be aware of how his or her structure, whether it liberates or just leads clergy to be content with this status quo. Because religious executives and hierarchical structures keep people's conscience because they control their positions and their security. And a lot of executives got to where they are by achieving within the status quo, by not rocking the boat too much. And it gets at, and that again gets at whether we're going to be prophets of the people or champions of the status quo. Not that you don't need the champions, but that can be safe.
Just say very simply, open your eyes, open your ears, open your heart, and don't hesitate to act. That's what we need to do.
I think that my guess is that, based on my experiences with a relatively small number of ministers and rabbis and religious leaders, they know, in some sense, that they should be doing more than they're doing, and they're terrified. Every one of them is terrified of their congregation. And often might say so. But even if they don't, it's very obvious. And I think that one of the things that has to be done is to give people like that and to give members of their congregation a way of addressing that fear and a way of addressing the very conflicted feelings that anybody in this country, in any country, probably has when doing something that is saying our government is wrong. That's a very hard thing to do, and it's a very hard thing for an organization. It's even harder for an organization to do it, and for a religious organization that, has all sorts of mixed feelings about things. Jews who say, I come here to make Shabbos. I don't want to do this. This happens every year. How do we deal with that kind of thing? We spend probably more time thinking about how to deal with stuff like that, how to bring it out, so that people could come to something on their own and feel that they own it. I think that's something we're thinking about. It's a problem that doesn't go away.
I want to open it up to our community here for any questions for our panelists.
So, thank you all. I guess one of the things is thinking back to that time, and even thinking about today. There's a commonality between where you all are coming from, but to a certain extent, it's a commonality of minorities within communities. So, kind of harking back to the question about, well, what about the rest of the Jewish community? What about the rest of the other communities? And there's a real tension, I think. In fact, even in Jewish tradition, there's basically a the same kind of thing you hear in Christian tradition of, render unto Caesar. There's actually a Jewish saying, which is Dina Makuta Dina, which is the law of the land. You have to have respect, and part of that is to keep our heads low, under the radar, so we survive. So my question is, and I really have a question, which is, was there a tension? Can you recall other congregations and even the institutional community saying we shouldn't be doing this because we should be more concerned about our community, making sure that we survive and we're okay?
It happens. I mean, it certainly happened in our congregation. We didn't get any pushback from the organized Jewish community in the Boston area. And in fact, it's interesting. This time around, this is very interesting. The Jewish Community Relations Council, which is one of the big umbrella organizations in the Boston area, actually decided that they wanted to co-sponsor sanctuary activities. And they sent one of their organizers around, a very impressive young woman. I mean, I was incredibly impressed with her. She was very sharp. In some sense, they kick-started our congregation again. A rabbi probably wouldn't have done it himself. And they got a lot of pushback, by the way, from very wealthy. It's the wealthier people who tend to be more right-wing, generally speaking. But it's a very mixed bag. Yes, those sort of quietistic traditions are absolutely there in Judaism. They're there in every religious tradition I've ever heard of. And yes, they have to be dealt with, and they really do have to be dealt with.
Oh, yes.
First of all, thank you. It's just felt really great to hear everybody here. I have never again about my children, but I remember those times they did. I'm just struck by all the courage and bravery. And I'm just wondering, so what do you do now in this moving forward, now with what's happening with the border and with, the Assembly and all the other I guess just to comment on the thing about law. The law suggests law outweighing it. It's not. There's no obligation to pay in just law. Just that somebody has law and just be paid. Doesn't mean somebody's wrong. So I guess I'm not about that. But I just wonder what's the way forward and what's happening currently and what can we do as individuals and as communities.
I don't think you should assume that you know what it is.
No, I'm not assuming that, but I'm just raising that as a question, for all of us.
I just had a very simple comment to make to the earlier question. Is just let the people lead and the leaders will follow. Don't hesitate. I mean, there was the question of the greater, organized Judaism. It didn't even play a part in our discussions about the law. It was irrelevant. What to do, what you have to do. I know that's simplistic. But our traditions are here to give us courage. I think the question about the current situation will be addressed by the second panel in the discussion.
And I'm going to insert myself in the question and answer time to invite us to thank our panel, and then we're going to take a break.